Where are my lefties at? Here at List 25, we've got you. And I mean that in every way possible. If you are left-handed, your brain developed a little differently from most people's, and it shows up in more places than just your handwriting. Over the years, scientists have linked left-handedness to a wide variety of health issues, from asthma to autoimmune diseases and even specific types of cancer. Now don't panic. These are statistics, not your destiny. But some of them do make a compelling argument. Ready? I'm Mike with List 25, and these are 25 ways being left-handed impacts your health. 25. Left-handedness and asthma. In the early 2010s, researchers wanted to see if asthma shows up any differently in left-handed people. So they surveyed 268 university students between 18 and 35 years old and discovered, out of the women, 29 said they had asthma or asthma-like symptoms, usually starting when they were kids. Among those 29, 6 were left-handed. So, not all that statistically significant, right? What was interesting, though, was that all of the left-handed women in the group said their asthma cleared up before the age of 18. Among the right-handed participants, 13 reported that their symptoms continued into adulthood. So, asthma continuing into adulthood was more common in the right-handed group. 24. Learning difficulties. Do left-handed kids have more issues with reading? Well, different research findings have been debated for years, but it's a fact that left-handers show up more than right-handers when you analyze groups with reading disabilities. In fact, some estimates suggest that the rate can be roughly 2.5 times higher. That doesn't mean being left-handed causes learning problems, but most left-handed children do process language and visual information differently. They may take longer to recognize letters, confuse similar shapes, or struggle to connect letters with sounds. However, the issue isn't ability, it's how the brain organizes reading and writing in the first place, and many catch up with the right kind of support. 23. The influence of birth stress. When scientists study handedness, they sometimes look all the way back to birth. Large population studies have found that premature delivery, low birth weight, or temporary oxygen shortages tend to appear more often in left-handed individuals. The thinking is that early stress may affect brain development in slight ways, including how the two hemispheres divide their responsibilities. There's also a popular theory known as pathological left-handedness, which connects mild neurological stress to changes in hand dominance. But that link is modest and statistical. Most left-handed people are born healthy, and for the vast majority, their hand preference simply reflects natural brain variation, not necessarily birth injuries. 22. The language advantage. To all the other righties watching this video, I'm sorry to say that being left-handed seems to come with great benefits too. For example, researchers published a large genetic and brain imaging study in the brain in 2019 using data from hundreds of thousands of people. They found that left-handed brains showed stronger connectivity between the hemispheres in areas responsible for language. Put simply, the two sides of the brain appear to talk to each other more in left-handers when it comes to verbal tasks. That stronger wiring has been linked to better verbal skills in some cases. The same study also reported a lower risk of Parkinson's disease among lefties. So while desks and notebooks may not always cooperate, the neurological trade-off might not be such a bad deal. 21. Schizophrenia. Obviously, this list can't be just full of good news. In most areas of mental health, and I say most since we've got a long way to go, left-handers fit the usual numbers. But that changes the moment any kind of psychosis becomes part of the diagnosis. A Yale team reviewed patient records at a public clinic and noticed that left-handers were rare in mood disorders, but unexpectedly common in psychotic ones. Depression and bipolar disorder sat right around normal levels. When it came to schizophrenia and schizoaffective disorder, on the other hand, that shot up to almost 40%. Even after controlling for things like race and community background, psychotic disorders still had a much higher share of left-handed patients. 20. Dyslexia. The supposed link between left-handedness and dyslexia lost a lot of steam once a team working in Massachusetts put it through a proper test. John Locke and Paul Macaruso gathered more than 1,000 students in the late 90s, including over 400 who were already enrolled in a school for kids with severe reading problems. Instead of relying on questionnaires or memories from parents, they had every student mime simple, everyday actions so they could watch which hand took over by instinct. The expectation at the time was that the dyslexic group would have leaned heavily left. It didn't. Their results matched the students from regular public schools almost beat for beat, right down to the ratio of left and right-handers. 19. Mood disorders. In 2021, a group of researchers working across 12 European countries pulled together a massive mental health survey that included more than 30,000 adults. They didn't set out to diagnose anyone, but simply asked whether any of the participants had ever gone through a stretch of low mood that lasted at least 2 weeks. When they compared the answers, the left-handed participants showed a small but steady bump in reported depressive symptoms. The study didn't go so far as to claim a cause, although the research team did point out that emotional regulation involves several brain regions that can be organized a little differently in our lefty brothers and sisters. 18. PTSD. One community survey carried out by psychologists in the late 90s added an unexpected element to PTSD research. They gathered 596 adults from the general population and used a self-compilation screening tool to check for trauma symptoms, while also recording whether each person was right, mixed, or left-handed. When they sorted the results, 51 people met the threshold for possible PTSD. And yes, that group had a noticeably higher number of strong left-handers than the rest of the sample. It wasn't a small difference either. The researchers also noticed that the left-handers in this subset scored higher on what they call arousal symptoms, things like being jumpy, on edge, or easily startled. So if you're a lefty and you tend to be a bit more anxious than your friends, just know you're not alone. 17. Sleep disturbances. A lot of left-handers will tell you their sleep feels lighter than everyone else's, and some of the biggest health questionnaires back that up in a quiet way. The pattern usually shows up in the complaints section. They've got more trouble winding down at night, more sudden wake-ups, and more mornings where they're so tired they can't get out of bed. Some scientists think that left-handers react more strongly to late-day stress and carry that tension into the night, which makes the sleep cycle easier to disrupt. It doesn't automatically mean that they sleep poorly every night, but they do seem to hit the rough patches more often than all of us right-handers. I've slept on a dining table through a vacuum. I don't really have trouble sleeping. 16. Epilepsy. When neurologists compared hundreds of epilepsy patients across 2 major hospitals, one in the United States and another in Korea, they noticed a bump in left-handers that they couldn't tie to anything else. Out of 478 people, 13.6% were either left-handed or ambidextrous. That alone is higher than normal, but the American group actually hit 17.6%. You'd expect numbers like that to link up with something practical, like seizure type or where the activity shows up on an EEG, but none of it matched. The left-handers weren't more likely to have a certain kind of epilepsy, didn't share a common age of onset, and weren't more or less likely to have treatment-resistant seizures. 15. Cardiovascular disease. A cardiovascular study in Georgia followed 379 adults between 2018 and 2022 and used 2 tests that usually reveal early trouble. One looked at how well the arteries relax after being squeezed off, and the other at how steady the heartbeat stays at rest. The left-handed volunteers scored lower on both. Their vessels opened less, and their heartbeat was jumpier than the doctors like to see, which usually points to extra strain. It didn't line up with age, fitness, race, HDL levels, or any of the usual suspects doctors lean on when interpreting health data. It also didn't appear in the right-handed group, even though the 2 sets of volunteers went through the exact same fasting, testing, and screening procedures. 14. Left-handed women and multiple sclerosis. One of the few big studies that looked at handedness and multiple sclerosis followed thousands of women in the US for years. When the researchers checked who developed MS later on, the left-handed women showed up more often than expected. And after age and lifestyle factors were sorted out, the left-handed group had about a 60% higher chance of getting an MS diagnosis than the right-handers. MS is already more common in women, so seeing a bump tied to handedness raised plenty of questions. Scientists are still trying to figure out how early life development fits into this picture. Handedness forms long before birth, and MS appears much later, so connecting those dots has turned into a much bigger challenge. 13. Body awareness. Ask people to follow a line on paper, and everyone looks about the same. Take the line away and tell them to trace it from memory, and the left-handers start to pull ahead. Several labs have checked this by taking vision out of the task and asking people to redo the same movement using feel alone. Just think lifting an arm to the same height twice, matching the angle of a joint, or bringing a hand back to a spot they can't see. The left-handed volunteers usually make cleaner adjustments. Coaches who train athletes and musicians have said the same thing for years. When the visual cues get messy, the left-handers keep their form better. The thinking is that they lean on their body awareness more naturally, the kind of I know where my arm is without seeing it sense that makes their movement smoother. 12. Emotion and handedness. There's a small corner of psychology that looks at how our brains fire up when we feel drawn towards something or pulled away from it. A group at the New School ran a study that gave the idea a little kick. They hooked up people to EEGs, checked which side of the brain was more active during rest, and then compared that data with questions about how strongly each person tends to move toward things they want. The pattern made sense in right-handers, with the left side of the brain showing more activity during strong approach motivation. Left-handers didn't follow that rule at all. Their brain actively switched to the opposite side. The team started calling it the sword and shield effect, because people usually reach for something with their dominant hand and guard themselves with the other. The brain seems to map those habits in how motivation is organized, giving left-handers a different emotional layout altogether. 11. Fear responses. I know this list is about the lefties, but let's give one item up for the guys who can't make up their minds. Out of every 100 people in the world, only one is truly ambidextrous, and their brains apparently don't work anything like ours whatsoever. In fear response tests, the mixed-handers are usually the ones who react first. A sudden sound or a quick flash on screen actually hits them harder and faster than it does the right or left-handers standing next to them. And the craziest bit is that they don't show any physical or outward signs of it at all. Their readings just rise sooner, almost like their gut instincts are running ahead of everyone else. 10. Left-handed women and cancer. A long-term project in the Netherlands tracked thousands of women for more than a decade and ended up finding something unusual. Before menopause, the left-handed women in the group were being diagnosed with breast cancer at about double the rate of the right-handers. Since that's really bizarre, the researchers kept circling back to what might have happened in the womb. People have been debating early life hormones for a long time, and some of the older research even suggested that certain estrogen-like exposures might nudge a child toward left-handedness. When you line that up with the idea that breast cancer risk can also be created before birth, the connection becomes harder to ignore. 9. The digestive health risks. Researchers in the UK had a rare chance to study something they never get to do. They followed thousands of kids from the 50s and the 70s all the way into adulthood, tracked who developed Crohn's or ulcerative colitis, and also had everyone's handedness on record from childhood. When the data was pulled together, the left-handers showed roughly double the odds of being diagnosed with either condition by their late 20s or early 30s. The numbers weren't massive in either study on their own, but they leaned the same way every time they ran the models. Nothing in the analysis pointed to lifestyle as the cause, so the team left the door open to early life factors or genetics playing a role. 8. Hand switching and stuttering. In the past, like our parents' or our grandparents' days, schools treated left-handed writing like a sin, and a lot of children were forced to use their right hand, whether they were right-handed or not. And a few early researchers started flagging cases where a child's stutter showed up around the same time that the force to the right hand happened. They didn't have brain scans or modern speech science, so they guessed that the hand change knocked the child's speech off track. Their reasoning made a lot of sense, and while it probably didn't help, we now know that stuttering isn't that simple. It runs in families, shows up in early childhood, and comes from a mix of genetics and the way speech signals fire in the brain. 7. The long-term effects. We can't just leave the force switching with its possible role in people's speech issues. You have to realize that those kids were corrected no matter what they were busy with, whether that was eating, painting, or counting buttons. Today, we know that hand preference is wired in early. When you force a child to override that wiring, the brain has to reroute, and that extra load can show up in strange ways. Slower motor development, more anxiety, and less confidence. Not every kid who switched suffered long-term effects. Some adapted and moved on, but enough studies were done on it to test its long-term effects. Luckily for everyone involved, these days kids are allowed to use whichever hand feels natural, and the practice has been dropped completely. 6. Income differences. Let's talk money for a second. I mean, that's tied to our health too, right? A few labor market studies have shown that, on average, left-handed people can earn slightly less than right-handers. Not massively less, not life-ruined less, just enough to show up in the data. Now, before anyone blames the brain again, the explanation probably sits somewhere else. For decades, classrooms, tools, factory equipment, and even computer setups were built for right-handed use. If you spent your entire childhood adapting to desks that don't fit and tools that fight you, that conflict adds up. It affects your training speed, comfort, and sometimes your confidence. Some researchers have also pointed out that left-handers show slightly higher rates of certain developmental issues, which can also ripple into their career paths over time. 5. A benefit when it comes to lung health. Some population data have indicated that left-handed people show slightly lower rates of certain lung problems, including chronic obstructive pulmonary disease and even severe pneumonia. The difference is modest, but still, a win is a win. No one has found an explanation for it yet. It could boil down to immune regulation or tiny differences in how the nervous system and respiratory system interact. Or it might just be one of those developmental peculiarities that shows up later in life. That said, smoking, air quality, and general health habits still dominate the conversation. Handedness barely moves the dial compared to those. 4. The differences in pain perception. Even pain might have a dominant side in our brains. In controlled experiments where volunteers are exposed to heat, pressure, or cold, the left-handed participants occasionally scored the sensation differently. And it doesn't stop at sensation. A handful of studies tracking pain relief have also noticed variations in how long it takes certain medications to kick in for left-handers versus right-handers. So, while most of us have always assumed that pain is universal, the experience itself may not be all that identical across the board. For lefties, both the sting and the relief can follow a different pattern. 3. The stress response differences. Do you remember how I said that the ambidextrous bunch seems to have a bit of a precognition or something like it when it came to potentially scary situations? Well, the lefties go into full-on anxiety mode. Instead of staying calm or getting faster reaction times, their physiological stress response simply spikes. Their heart rates go up and the stress hormone increases. So their nervous system basically went the other way. Scientists think it's got something to do with the differences in how their emotional and threat processing networks are organized. Their bodies respond with a more pronounced stress signal before the conscious mind has time to catch up. 2. A different kind of comeback. When someone has a stroke, one of the biggest fears is losing speech or movement on one side of the body. For most right-handed people, language is packed tightly into the left hemisphere. If that area takes a hit, their recovery can be an uphill climb. However, in many lefties, the language and motor control are spread out more evenly across both hemispheres. It's less centralized. So when doctors follow patients after a stroke or head injury, they sometimes see left-handed people regain the ability to communicate or move a bit sooner. That's because the other half of the brain is more ready to jump in and help, almost like having a backup system already wired and waiting. Now, damage is still damage, but that built-in flexibility can provide options that the brain wouldn't otherwise have. 1. Left-handers die younger. If you're a lefty, someone, somewhere, might have cornered you at some point in your life with the crazy claim that lefties die sooner. This one is very controversial for a reason. In the late 80s and early 90s, a pair of researchers published studies that claimed left-handed people lived several years less than right-handers. They basically worked off the premise that since we live in a right-handed world, think heavy machinery, cars, factory equipment, and so on, lefties would end up having more serious accidents across the board. More accidents would mean shorter lives. The media loved it. But there was a wrinkle in their thinking. Their data was compiled at a time when people were still forced to switch to using their right hands, meaning at least 10% or so of their right-handed participants were actually left-handed. Once that was compared to younger groups, where people reported their natural dominance more freely, it fell flat. And once researchers corrected for that generational reporting bias, the lifespan gap mostly vanished. Today, most experts consider the original claim flawed rather than fatal. And that's a wrap. Just know that a lot of these aren't fully medically proven yet, so don't despair. Okay, lefties, it's time to speak up. What's the one thing about living in a right-handed world that still drives you crazy? Drop it in the comments below. And please, feel free to educate the rest of us. My dad was a lefty. And if today felt a little too serious, our related video takes a different angle. It jumps into the everyday struggles left-handers deal with, from smudged ink on their assignments to badly designed desks. The link to that one's going to show up right about here. Hey, my left hand. Thanks for watching, and I'll be keeping an eye on the comments. As always, like, share, comment, subscribe, and notification bell so you don't miss out on any new content, and I will see you again next time. Let me use my left hand. That felt weird.